We have 50 states to choose from.
We lay everything on the altar for the truth.
What if everything you thought you knew about Daystar was a lie? For the first time ever, Jonathan Lamb breaks his silence and reveals the shocking truth behind the network's mysterious billion-dollar fortune. Hidden deals, internal power struggles, and secrets they never wanted the public to know. It's all coming out now. This isn't just a story. It's a scandal that could shake the foundation of Christian media. Don't miss the full exposé. The truth is finally here. Jonathan Lamb didn't just grow up around the Daystar network. He grew up inside it. From a young age, he watched his father, Marcus Lamb, build a Christian media empire from the ground up. It wasn't just a job for Marcus. It was a mission. It was personal. And everyone around them, including Jonathan, knew that one day the torch would be passed down. It wasn't a vague dream or an unspoken hope. It was something that felt written into the story of their family. It was expected. By the time Jonathan was a young adult, the path ahead of him was already laid out. He was being prepared, step by step, for leadership. Not just spiritually, but practically too. He was on the screen, behind the scenes, in meetings, involved in decision-making. People inside the organization saw him as the next in line. It was never a mystery who would take over when Marcus was gone. And when Marcus tragically passed away in 2021, there was no confusion about what came next. The plan had already been signed, sealed, and confirmed. Jonathan Lamb wasn't just a possible candidate, he was officially named the future president of Daystar. Imagine that for a second. Not maybe, not possibly, but absolutely in writing. There aren't many people in the world who get handed that kind of opportunity. A billion-dollar organization, global reach, millions of viewers, staff ready to follow. All of it was positioned to stay in the family. It wasn't just about filling a role. It was about carrying on a legacy. The legacy of his father. The legacy of Christian broadcasting. And to many people around him, it seemed obvious. Jonathan had the last name, he had the experience, he had the blessing. What else was there to think about? This kind of transition usually comes with uncertainty, board meetings, power struggles. But in this case, everything was already decided. Everyone knew. Jonathan was the guy. And for a moment, it looked like the story would unfold just the way it was supposed to. Smoothly, predictably, like a well-written script. The son rises, takes over the father's empire, and continues the mission.
That was the time we were more ready than ever. I mean, it was the wrestle and breaking of me begging God, when will Jonathan be ready?
From the outside, it probably looked perfect. Jonathan stepping into his father's shoes, honoring his legacy, and leading Daystar into the next chapter. That's the story people expected, and honestly, Jonathan probably expected it too. After all, he had spent his life preparing for this. He knew the organization inside and out. He had the heart for ministry. He loved the people. And it wasn't like the opportunity came out of nowhere. It was something he had been building toward for years. But as time went on, something started to shift. Not in the public eye, not yet, but deep inside. Jonathan began to feel that the role he was stepping into came with more than just responsibility. It came with weight, with pressure, with expectations that didn't always line up with his personal convictions. And though the path was still open in front of him, and the legacy still his to take, the cost of saying yes started to feel heavier than he expected. Still, at this point in the story, none of that was public. None of it was even clear yet. All that mattered was that the plan was in place. Jonathan was set to become president. His wife, Susie, had taken on a bigger role too. The salary was higher. The platform was larger. Their names were more visible than ever. It was the kind of transition that most families, most ministries dream about. No drama, no confusion, just legacy carried forward. And that's what makes their story so unexpected, because everything was lined up for them. Everything was already theirs. They didn't have to fight for it. They didn't have to prove anything. They just had to step in. But sometimes, what looks like a blessing from the outside can feel like a burden on the inside. And that's where Jonathan's real story begins. Not when he was handed the title, but when he started questioning what that title really meant. Still, for a time, everything looked perfect on paper. The promised legacy was intact. The path to power was wide open. And no one, absolutely no one, saw what was coming next. At first, everything looked like it was going according to plan. Jonathan had stepped into his new role, the organization was stable, and from the outside it seemed like the natural next chapter in the Daystar story. The son of Marcus Lamb had taken his place. The cameras were still rolling, the lights were still bright, the message was still going out to millions around the world. But behind the scenes, things weren't sitting quite right, especially for Jonathan. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't one big moment where everything suddenly crumbled. It was slow, quiet, a gradual tension that started to build. One conversation, one meeting, one uneasy feeling at a time. There were things being said and things left unsaid that started to weigh on him. Jonathan began to feel that his new role wasn't just about leading, it was about protecting something, and not necessarily something holy. He felt the pressure, not just to carry on his father's mission, but to keep the image intact, to say the right things, to smile when the cameras were on, to avoid controversy, to play along. That was the unspoken expectation. There was a narrative to keep up, and now he was at the center of it. Being vice president of a global Christian network wasn't just about faith and vision, it was about performance. And the more he stepped into that world, the more it started to clash with the convictions he held deep in his heart. Jonathan and Susie would have long conversations late at night. These weren't strategy talks or brand meetings. These were painful, honest, soul-searching moments. They would talk about what they were seeing, about the things that didn't feel right, about the growing sense that something was off. They'd pray, they'd cry, they'd wrestle, not with the public, but with God and with each other. They were living in a world that was supposed to be built on truth, but it started to feel more like a system, a machine, a media empire that had drifted from its original purpose. Jonathan had grown up believing that Daystar was about spreading the gospel, about ministering to people, about following God no matter what. But now, as a leader, he started to see that a lot of the decisions being made weren't driven by prayer or purpose. They were driven by politics, PR, and preserving power. He felt like he was being pulled in two directions. On one hand, he had the responsibility of honoring his father's legacy, of leading the organization well, of stepping up as the man everyone believed he could be. But on the other hand, he felt like saying yes to all of that meant saying no to his own soul. Because more and more, he realized that leading Daystar wasn't just about running a ministry, it was about managing an image. It was about knowing when to stay quiet, when to nod along, when to go with the flow, even if that flow was going in the wrong direction. That's when the internal struggle started to get loud. Jonathan wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was broken. And that kind of breaking doesn't always look dramatic. It's not always a meltdown or a blow-up. Sometimes it's just sitting on the edge of your bed, night after night, asking God the same question: is this really what you want for me? And not hearing an answer right away. Just silence, just confusion, just the weight of everything pressing in. Susie felt it too. She wasn't just a supportive wife in the background. She was right there with him, in the trenches, facing the same tension. She had her own doubts, her own fears. She looked at their kids and wondered what kind of example they were setting. Were they showing them how to be obedient? Or were they just teaching them how to survive in a system that demanded silence in exchange for security? They didn't want to fake it. They didn't want to become the kind of leaders who smiled on stage, but were falling apart behind closed doors. But the deeper they got into their roles, the harder it became to ignore the compromises. Jonathan started to notice how easy it was to justify things, to call it wisdom when really it was fear, to call it strategy when it was really self-preservation. He knew the language, he knew how to spin it, but he also knew what it felt like to be far from peace. There were moments when Jonathan sat in meetings, nodding, agreeing, going along with decisions that made his stomach turn. He'd walk out and feel a pit in his gut, wondering how he got there, wondering if the boy who once dreamed of serving God would even recognize the man he had become. He wasn't chasing money. He wasn't after fame. He just wanted to do what was right. But doing what was right was starting to feel impossible inside the world he had inherited. The pressure to stay in line was real. There was an unspoken code. You don't talk about certain things. You don't question the system. And you definitely don't go public with your doubts. That would be disloyal. That would be dangerous. That would be betrayal. And for someone like Jonathan, who loved his family and respected everything his father had built, that was the hardest part. He didn't want to tear anything down. He didn't want to cause division, but he also didn't want to lose himself. He and Susie began to understand that this wasn't just a job. It wasn't just a paycheck. It was a test of obedience, a test of character, a test of whether they would follow the script that had been handed to them or follow the still, quiet voice of God that was now starting to grow louder in their hearts. That voice didn't offer a clear plan. It didn't come with the promise of safety or success, but it did offer peace, and that peace only came when they thought about stepping away, letting go, walking out, not in protest, but in surrender. That idea terrified them. What would people think? What would the church say? What would happen to their future? But as scary as it was, it also felt like the only honest option left, because staying meant pretending. Staying meant putting on a show. Staying meant continuing to build something that no longer felt true to who they were or what they believed. And eventually, Jonathan realized that no title, no legacy, no ministry empire was worth losing his peace over. He didn't want to be another voice in a polished system. He wanted to be someone who could look in the mirror and know he was following God, even if it cost him everything. That was the turning point. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about ambition. It was about conscience, about calling, about the kind of legacy he actually wanted to leave. And that legacy wasn't going to be built by climbing higher. It was going to be built by stepping away. And that's exactly what they decided to do. Walking away wasn't part of the original plan. Not for Jonathan, not for Susie, not for anyone who had followed the Daystar story from the beginning. Everything seemed locked in. The legacy, the leadership, the future. It was written, signed, and sealed. Jonathan Lamb was set to be the next president of a billion-dollar Christian media empire. And no one, absolutely no one, expected him to walk away from all of it. But that's exactly what happened. The decision didn't come suddenly. It wasn't emotional or impulsive. It was slow, quiet, and painful. The kind of decision that forms in long conversations, tearful prayers, sleepless nights, and moments of deep soul-searching. Jonathan and Susie knew what they were walking away from. This wasn't just any job. This wasn't just any paycheck. It was everything they'd been building toward. Everything they'd been promised, everything the world would call a blessing. But deep down, they both knew they couldn't stay. From the outside, people probably thought they had it all. High positions, financial stability, global influence. And for a little while, they did. The paychecks had gotten bigger. The future looked bright. They were leading on paper. But inside, the peace was gone. The mission didn't feel the same anymore. The weight of what they were being asked to carry, the image, the silence, the performance, it was slowly wearing them down. They had to ask themselves a hard question. Are we willing to lose our peace just to keep the platform? That question haunted them because they had worked so hard to get where they were. Jonathan had grown up in this ministry. Susie had supported him through it all. They had sacrificed years of their lives, made tough decisions, lived through pressure most people never saw. And now, after finally reaching the top, they were thinking about walking away? It didn't make sense to most people, but it made perfect sense to them. They weren't angry. They weren't running from failure. They weren't trying to make a statement. They were simply trying to follow what they believed God was asking them to do, even if it meant giving up everything. And giving it up wasn't easy. They had kids, a home, bills, responsibilities. There was no massive savings account waiting for them, no secret fortune, no golden parachute. They weren't leaving Daystar with millions in the bank. They were stepping out into the unknown with nothing but faith. And that's what made their choice so real, so raw, so human. They had every reason to stay. Most people in their shoes would have. The power, the comfort, the security, it was all there. But Jonathan and Susie realized something that shifted everything for them. Just because something is good on paper doesn't mean it's good for your soul. They could have kept going, played the game, smiled for the cameras, collected the checks, held the title, but inside they knew that staying would have meant slowly losing themselves, compromising little by little, letting go of what they believed in, not all at once, but piece by piece. And for them, that wasn't an option. So they chose the harder road. They let it all go, quietly. No dramatic exit, no media storm, no finger-pointing or public criticism, just a quiet, firm, painful yes to God, and a no to everything else. They walked away with peace, not the kind of peace the world gives, the kind that comes with comfort and control, but the kind of peace that only comes from doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything. And for them, it did cost a lot. Overnight, the income stopped. They still had a mortgage. They still had groceries to buy. Life didn't pause because they made a bold decision. It kept moving. But they moved with it, trusting that the God who called them to step away would be the same God who would carry them through the next season. Susie once shared that she was prepared to downsize, sell their house if needed, cut back, budget, do whatever it took to follow the peace they felt. There was no pride in that, no bitterness, just surrender. And that surrender, that choice to give it all up, became the most honest part of their story. It's easy to say you'd give everything for God. It's easy to sing the songs, post the quotes, preach the message. But when the time actually comes, when everything you've worked for, everything that brings comfort and status, is put on the altar, that's when you find out what you really believe. For Jonathan and Susie, it wasn't just about leaving Daystar. It was about leaving the illusion. The illusion that ministry equals power, that success equals blessing, that image matters more than truth. They were done pretending, done performing, done carrying the weight of a system that didn't reflect who they were anymore. Their walk away wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was brave. Brave in a quiet, humble, spiritual kind of way. The kind of bravery that doesn't need applause because it's rooted in obedience, not attention. They didn't burn bridges. They didn't create drama. They just said, "We can't do this anymore." And then they walked out with their heads held high and their hearts open to whatever came next. People didn't understand at first. Many still don't. Why would they leave something so secure? Why give up what most people spend their whole lives chasing? But that's the point. Jonathan and Susie weren't chasing what most people chase. They were after something deeper, something eternal, something honest. And that honesty came with a price. But it also came with freedom. The kind of freedom you can't fake. The kind that comes from knowing that no matter how much you've walked away from, you've kept your soul intact. And sometimes that's the most valuable thing you can have. For a long time, leadership in ministry, especially on big platforms, has looked a certain way. It's usually polished, confident, well-spoken, and in control. Leaders are expected to be strong, certain, and inspiring. They're expected to have all the answers, hold their ground, and never show weakness. And when it comes to big ministries, with money, media, and influence, leadership starts to look more like business than faith. Jonathan and Susie Lamb didn't fit that mold anymore. And truthfully, they didn't want to. Not because they were rebels or trying to make a scene, but because they began to realize that real leadership, the kind that honors God, doesn't always look like standing on a stage with a microphone. Sometimes it looks like stepping down quietly when no one understands why. That's what made their decision so rare. Jonathan was supposed to be the next president of Daystar. He had the name, the background, the experience, and most importantly, the official plan in writing. He was the natural choice. Everyone around him knew it. He didn't have to fight for the role, it was already his. And most people would have seen that as confirmation. This must be God's will. But Jonathan saw things differently. Jonathan saw things differently. The deeper he got into leadership, the more he started to ask hard questions, not about the job itself, but about what leadership had become in that space. Was it really about serving others, or was it about maintaining power? Was it about living with integrity, or protecting an image? Was it about following God, or following tradition? The more he looked around, the more he felt like something had gotten lost. The original purpose, the mission to spread truth, love, and the gospel, had gotten buried under layers of branding, PR, and politics. It hit him. Leadership isn't about holding a title, it's about holding truth. And if he had to give up the title to hold on to the truth, he was willing to do it. That's not the kind of leadership most people are used to, especially in the world of Christian media, where everything is built on visibility, growth, and audience engagement. But Jonathan and Susie decided that leadership wasn't about who could talk the loudest or lead the biggest crowd. It was about who could live the most honestly, even when no one was watching. They weren't trying to start something new or build their own brand. They weren't running off to create another ministry or launch a competing platform. They just wanted to live aligned with their values, their faith, and their peace. And that meant letting go of something almost everyone else would have held on to. That kind of leadership isn't flashy. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't come with applause. But it's real. And, in today's world, that kind of realness is desperately needed. Because so many leaders are exhausted. So many are stuck in systems that demand perfection and punish vulnerability. So many are afraid to tell the truth because they might lose their influence. Jonathan and Susie felt that pressure too. But instead of letting it shape them, they stepped away from it. They said, no more pretending, no more playing a part, no more choosing comfort over conviction. And in doing that, they showed a different way. They showed that leadership is sometimes about sacrifice. Sometimes it's about loss. Sometimes it means walking away from everything you've built because you know it's not what God wants for you anymore. And that's hard, but it's also holy. Jonathan didn't leave because he was weak. He left because he was strong enough to admit the truth, that staying would have meant slowly becoming someone he wasn't. Susie didn't step away because she couldn't handle the pressure. She stepped away because she wanted to raise her kids in truth, not just talk about it from a stage, but actually live it out at home. That's the kind of leadership that doesn't always get recognized, but it changes everything.